Hello and welcome to Novelty. My name is Levon Baronian and I'll be your host and curator of exploration of this new endeavor. For those of our viewers who I haven't had the opportunity to meet yet, please allow me to briefly introduce myself. I'm a lifelong Angelino, born and raised in Los Angeles to immigrant Armenian parents. My background is in computer science and software engineering, and for over 20 years, that's what I've been doing professionally, building complex software apps for institutions of all sizes, including 8 years at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Since my early adulthood, I've been a member of and leader of various nonprofit, civic, and fraternal organizations. I'm currently an elected member of the Sherman Oaks Neighborhood Council in the city of Los Angeles. In addition to my family, I deeply care about my community, my city, and the two nations I belong to, the country I was born in and call my home, the United States, and the country of my ancestors and where my roots are from, Armenia. Our mission with this new program, Novelty, is to create a platform to discuss the latest advancements, groundbreaking ideas, and societal shifts that resonate with individuals from all walks of life, from a unique perspective in Los Angeles, but also extending to the entire world. In each episode, we'll embark on a journey of intellectual discovery, delving deep into the intricacies of recent events shaping our world, globally and locally. Our mission is to provide comprehensive analysis, offer fresh perspectives, and engage with the forefront of innovation. Accompanying me will be esteemed experts, trailblazers in their respective fields, who will bring their wealth of knowledge and insights to enrich our discussions. From groundbreaking technological advancements to the complexities of political landscapes and the nuanced fabric of societal dynamics, Novelty pledges to keep you abreast of what's current, relevant, and transformative. So let's prepare to embark on a journey of enlightenment and exploration. Join us as we navigate the ever-evolving landscape of ideas and innovation on Novelty. Welcome. So today we have a very special guest on our inaugural episode. I'm very happy to have Rostom Sarkissian here with me today. A little bit about Rostom. Rostom is a Los Angeles-based public affairs professional with over 20 years of experience in political campaigns, and he actually ran for Los Angeles City Council in 2015. His education includes a master's degree from Harvard Kennedy School of Government with a concentration in housing, urban economic development, and transportation. He also holds a BA in diplomacy and world affairs from Occidental College. Welcome, Rostom. Thank you for being my first guest on Novelty.
Thank you so much for having me, Levon. I'm very excited to be here today and to have this conversation with you and with your audience.
Absolutely. So today we're going to be talking about a very relevant topic. We all just went through elections nationally, at the state level, but also at the very local level. And so today we want to kind of recap what we went through a few weeks ago in terms of elections, starting locally, and then we'll kind of move up to potentially some state election races and not more importantly, because all of these are important, but also talk about a little bit later on the presidential primaries and what we can expect in November. Okay, so let's start with the local elections, Rostom. I mean, in California, voter turnout was lower than what we saw 4 years ago, particularly in Los Angeles County, where we live. I think voter turnout was roughly about 30%, compared to about 40% 4 years ago in the March primaries in 2020. What are some of the reasons why we saw such low voter turnout?
So in general, in elections where there's not really excitement at the top of the ticket, you tend to see low turnouts. And in this cycle, we saw that Joe Biden was the presumptive Democratic nominee. He was going to be the nominee. He is the nominee now in terms of delegates. Same with Donald Trump. So at the top of the ticket, there wasn't really something driving it. And the most exciting race, if you will, like exciting being something that people were watching nationally, was the Senate race for Dianne Feinstein's seat. But having said that, the Senate race is not going to drive turnout the way a presidential would. So we can compare ourselves to 4 years ago and say there was a reduction in turnout. But again, it's better to compare this cycle to maybe the off-year election of 2022 or 2018. And when you look at that, we're about par for the course.
I see. So it's a very good point. So in November of 2020, Republicans came out to choose the Republican presidential nominee, right? And Democrats came out to choose, especially, that was very important in local races here in California, because you have such a big percentage of registered Democrats as opposed to Republicans. 2020, the Democratic Party was going to choose its presidential nominee, right? So it was a race between Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, I believe, and that drove out a high voter turnout. So this time around, we did see lower turnout than 4 years ago, but you make a good point that maybe a good comparison point is an off-year election, and you're right, the numbers are roughly about the same. So let's delve right into kind of some of the local elections that we saw here in Los Angeles, and we'll talk about Glendale as well. One of the city council races that a lot of people were looking at, primarily because one of the candidates in this district number 2, Audrey Nazarian, raised and had the most amount of money out of all of the city council candidates running across all of the different districts in Los Angeles. And we have the results here that we can look at in that district. Audrey Nazarian came in with 37%, a little over 37% of the vote, followed closely by, surprisingly, Jillian Burgos, who came in at 22%, and then followed by Sam Kabushian at 14%. Now, Audrey Nazarian's campaign had a lot of money. When we look at the numbers there, between what he raised, which was about $664,000, and what was spent by outside groups of $278,000, there was a total of $943,000 there. And interestingly enough, Jillian Burgos, who came in second place, had only raised $74,000, but came in, second place, and basically forced Audrey into a runoff. What do you have to say about this? I mean, generally, when we look at Los Angeles City Council elections, there's a rule of thumb that says money kind of buys it. But in this case, we saw somebody like a Jillian Burgos come in and catapult herself to second place and potentially put Audrey Nazarian in a tough spot in November.
So one of the things that Audrey had above and beyond the money was the name ID. This is somebody who's been the state assembly member representing parts of that district for years. So that was a built-in advantage that he had. I would have thought that actually more was spent on this race than it was. I'm surprised that it was under $1 million for Audrey between what he raised and what he spent. So it wasn't necessarily an overwhelming amount that was being spent. I think what was driving his turnout was the fact that people knew who he was. And the fact that they knew who he was made it so he could raise more money. But the gap that you see between Audrey and Kabushian and some of the others isn't as grand as you might see in other races.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, a lot of pundits were expecting Audrey to actually win outright in the primary, given the name recognition, Audrey Nazarian, and coming in at 37% is a little bit surprising. And here we have a graphic that kind of shows how much money was raised and spent by each candidate, and how that translated into votes per $100 spent. And we look at Audrey Nazarian, that number, $1.40 or 1.49 votes per $100 spent, followed by Sam Kabushian, is kind of very, very low ROI, I would say, compared to Jillian Burgos, who effectively got 11 votes per $100 spent. So I think this kind of turns it on its head that in Los Angeles City Council, if you don't have big money or spend big money, that you can't be a viable contender. Would you say?
Absolutely. So Jillian Burgos, I'm not sure exactly. I was surprised when I saw the results because I saw Kabushian in second place for a long time. But then it was that mirage, right? What comes in, what gets counted first and what gets counted second. And the fact that she kept making strides in every vote count and got closer and closer, he got into second place. I think that this is a candidate to watch in the general because the dynamics in the general are going to be different than they were in the primary. There's going to be more voters. There's going to be more female voters that are going to vote. There's going to be more progressive voters that are going to vote. It's going to be a more democratic turnout in general. And even though California is not going to have much of a role to play in the presidential election cycle, California voters are going to be just as excited at the fact that they're going to be able to vote at the top of the ticket for the candidate they want. So I think there's going to be overall enthusiasm and excitement in November. There's going to be greater turnout. There's going to be more women voters because of the Dobbs ruling in the Supreme Court. So I think this is a race where I wouldn't be surprised seeing somebody like Jillian Burgos get close to, if not beating, what's presumed to be an incumbent-like candidate, somebody who's got a long record in that district.
Yeah, Audrey's, I mean, the closest thing you could be to an incumbent without actually being an incumbent, right?
Yeah, not only is he have the name ID from previous races, but he's also got strong relationships with the council president, Paul Krikorian. Had his full support.
Sure.
He had the support of the leaders in Los Angeles, a lot of elected officials across the state.
Yeah.
So it was definitely institution, inside versus outside in this race. And we're going to see that play out in November.
Interesting. So another race that was also very interesting in the city of Los Angeles was in District 4. Because this was also another race where huge amounts of money were spent, and actually turned out that record amounts of money were spent for a primary Los Angeles City Council race. This was incumbent Nithya Raman facing two challengers, Ethan Weaver and a certain Levon Baronian. So also in this race, there was a huge amount of money spent. Interestingly enough, Rostom, in this particular race, voter turnout was actually much higher than in the county as a whole.
Yeah.
Over here, the turnout was roughly around 40 to 45%, I believe, whereas the county was at 29%. So I guess the big money spent did result in at least a bigger voter turnout in this district. But also here, we had a similar type of situation as you just mentioned earlier with Sam Kabushin was in second place in CD2, and then Jillian Burgos came and overcame her. Here, there was a similar situation. Nithya Raman was actually hovering at around 46 to 48% until about 6th or 7th day after voting was counted, and pushed ahead over 50%. What do you think that it's the same kind of phenomenon happening there?
Okay, so there's two parts of what you said. Number one is the dollars spent in voter turnout.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that you can say that more dollars were spent, so there was more turnout, and there's truth to that. But also this district tends to be more affluent, tends to be more active, and I don't know what it looks like now after redistricting, but I know that CD4 has always had generally higher turnout relative to other council districts in Los Angeles.
It has.
So that's got that built-in advantage of more voters.
Yes.
So having more money then means that you can reach more voters who are going to vote anyway to try to get them to vote for you. In terms of Nithya Raman's count 6 or 7 days prior to winning, as you're saying, again, that's also a normal part of the way voting is done. People who mail ballots in advance are usually people who are, what's the word? Not necessarily pushed, but there's people who are very determined who they're going to vote for in advance, and they send them in
Early.
There's people who are likely to vote for a candidate, and if the candidates can ascertain that in advance, they encourage them to vote early.
So vote harvesting, as some people call it.
Yeah, I think vote harvesting has, some people use the word harvesting to mean something negative, like you're collecting it, you're taking it from what it belongs to, right? You can say that they chase the vote. You can say that they basically
elicit the vote.
There's a lot of different ways you can call it. I mean, I'll use the word harvesting too if that's easier. But the idea that you're getting people who are low propensity voters to vote
In a certain way, though.
Well, you're getting them because they're your supporters. If you wouldn't have one of your volunteers or one of your staff go talk to a voter and find out that voter is not going to vote for you, and then actively encourage them to mail in the ballot. You're a good government type, so you might do that. But in general, if you're a campaign, you're trying to get to 50% plus one. If you identify somebody who you think is your voter, then you're going to do everything possible to make sure that ballot is sent in and that vote is banked.
That's assuming that it's always the case that you're going after people that you know are your voters. I mean, in some cases, if somebody's knocking on your door and saying, hey, I'm here for Nithya Raman's campaign, asking you to vote, it might elicit the vote out of that person who might not have even known who Nithya Raman is.
And, at that point, you tip your hat to that volunteer or staffer who's able to get this person to go from not knowing anything about the race to wanting to vote for your candidate, right?
But what's different there, Rostom, is that, and this changed kind of, dramatically in California when we went to a completely vote by mail system like 5 years ago, right? Before, you only had people who were registered as absentee ballot recipients, which was roughly about 20% maybe. Now you went to 100% basically absentee ballot system. If I was going to vote at a polling place inside a voting booth, nobody's there with me, right? You don't know who I'm voting for. You might have campaigned to me. I might have told you I'm going to vote for you, but I go there. I still have that anonymity, and I can vote for whoever I want. Wouldn't you say it's a little bit different when somebody comes and knocks on your door and kind of potentially even sits with you to help you to vote? At that point, you don't really have that anonymity, right? So it's a little bit of a different scenario, right? I mean, it is harvesting in a way.
So if something illegal is done, it is illegal, and there's punishments for that. There's a bunch of federal statutes. There's a bunch of state statutes. If something is done where there's no legality, there's nothing unethical about it, they're just basically trying to convince you to vote for them, then whether they were in the house with you or whether they were in the polling place with you, it makes no difference. And for people, by the way, as somebody who's volunteered at LA County on election day, if somebody walks into a polling place and says, I'm not really sure, I can't see too good, I don't have somebody to help me, can someone come into the polling place? We ask them, are you okay with us doing it? Or are you okay with selecting somebody to do it? We'll read the names for you. You can pick out who you want to vote for. If they give you permission to do it, if the voter says it is acceptable, then you go ahead and you help them out.
Sure.
And for some people, it might actually be, I can't do it. I have arthritis in my hands. I can't fill in the bubbles. Can you do it? Right?
But it systemically changes the dynamics of voting. I mean, we have to agree on that, right? As opposed to over 5 years ago when most people had to themselves go to a voting center and vote, right? Now everybody's getting the ballot in mail, and now compound that with whoever has a stronger field game. I agree with you. It's not necessarily illegal, right? The rules are set up to kind of encourage that. But it changes the dynamics of voting.
It's also not unethical. There's nothing unethical about going to somebody and saying, hey, vote for my candidate, and having that person vote for your candidate. So in 2004, I worked in Oregon for the Kerry campaign. And that was a state where it was vote by mail throughout. Everybody got a ballot in the mail. And there was a concern about what happens if we pick up a ballot or not. And I remember that was a concern that I had because I worked in Los Angeles races where if in the city of Los Angeles, a voter signed an absentee ballot application, not even the ballot, the application, legally I was not allowed to touch that application anymore because that was against the law. So we didn't do it. We would convince people that it's in their best interest to vote from home. If they were agreeable to that, we would give them the form, they would fill it out, and we'd say, you know what, you have to mail it. We wouldn't even give them a stamp because giving them a stamp would then be the equivalent of us trying to buy their vote.
Yeah, because you're paying.
Because that's not the thing. But what we're doing is we're identifying who our voters are. And this is like, I know a lot of people are watching this, but I know there's also Armenian Americans who are watching this as well. So for the Armenian Americans who are watching this, I would say that whatever political power exists in Southern California, specifically in Southern California in the past 20 years, in Glendale, in the Assembly, in City Council and all that, was done because of what you would call vote harvesting, right? But at the time, it was basically going and empowering people who were...
Are you talking about, people like Paul Krikorian and Audrey Nazarian?
Paul Krikorian, Audrey Nazarian, Rafi Manoukian, Ardi Kasakian. All these campaigns basically were trying to convince their voters to apply to vote from home, get a ballot at home. We would remind people to vote that their ballots had arrived because we knew that, and we would ask them to mail it in. And in certain instances, people would say, can you help us? Genuinely, can you help us? And we're always very careful making sure that we had some kind of a protocol where we could say, you can do this and you can't do this, right? So the political power that exists within in Southern California for Armenian Americans happened because Armenian Americans went and did what you're calling vote harvesting.
Sure.
The convincing and the turnout of voters that traditionally would not have voted.
But basically now that's become universalized, and whoever can effectively have the ground game to do it is going to come out on top. And we're seeing, at least in Los Angeles, that over the last couple of elections, the DSA has been very effective in doing that, whatever we want to call it.
The Democratic
Socialists of America. And Jillian Burgos in CD2 is also affiliated with that particular group, as is Nithya Raman, as is Hugo Martinez in the adjacent district. So that's going to be interesting to watch. As you explain, it might not be illegal or unethical, but it definitely has changed the way that votes are effectively elicited, and the organizations and groups that can do that effectively are going to have a bigger say. Now, you mentioned the Armenian vote. That's also, obviously we're both Armenian. This is an Armenian channel. It's very interesting that we basically see an Armenian community that's very resistant to coming out to vote, it seems. Like whatever we try.
Voting in general or voting in person?
Both. I mean, in terms of turnout, like even this time around, we saw, I have some numbers, at least in CD2. Let me pull those up real quick. In CD2, we have numbers where there were only about, out of the 6,000 Armenians that are registered to vote in CD2, only about 1,600 voted. This is with an Armenian candidate and with one Armenian candidate, Levon Baronian.
So right around where turnout was, 27, 28%, somewhere around there.
4 years ago, it was about 1,200 votes, and today it's 1,600 votes. Yeah. So we're seeing even cases where Armenian Americans are coming out to vote, even when you have Armenian candidates. Also in CD4, where you had 3 Armenian candidates, CD2, with Adrian Nazarian, Sam Kabushin, and Marin Gandilian. You had 3 Armenian candidates, and from what I've gathered, even there, I think there was only about 3,800 Armenian Americans who voted out of roughly 13,000 in the district, with 3 Armenian candidates. So what would you say are the reasons for this, Rostom? I know historically we've talked about, Armenians come from countries where there hasn't been a strong institution of democracy, so they don't trust the voting process. Former Soviet Union, the Middle East, Iran, whatnot. But given that our community has now been here for, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, we have people who are, second, third generation Armenian Americans. Why do we have this reluctance to vote in the Armenian American community?
Well, we vote at rates as all other Americans.
No, we actually don't. That's the thing. It's
a little bit lower. So we're at like 25% turnout versus, let's say, 30% turnout, which I think is what we were. We were at 29%.
But there are other demographic groups that are similar to Armenians, that vote higher.
If you're asking about what is it about Armenians that makes us not likely to vote, there could be parts of what you said, right? We come from countries in the Middle East, in the diaspora, or from Armenia, post-Soviet state. Voting didn't necessarily exist, and if it did, it was more of like a formality, something that you do for the sake of doing, right? There's some Armenians who don't necessarily believe in the political process in this country. They don't necessarily feel like their vote matters. There's some people who don't see what the point of voting is if it's not going to make a difference, just because of the background of where diasporan Armenians have come from.
Sure.
So I think that might be a driver.
We're all diaspora Armenians now here, but in general, even in Armenia. So interesting. So let's also touch upon some of the races in Glendale. There were city council races, school board races. In Glendale, we saw Ardashes Kasakian come in first place with 22%, and Vartan Karapetyan come in second place with 16.5%. In Glendale, is it automatic, or is there also going to be a runoff in November, or is it the top 2 vote getters automatically get elected to city council?
I believe that in Glendale, it's automatic. It's the top 2 vote getters. I don't know if Glendale's law is aligned with the state, or in the city of Los Angeles, about 50% plus 1.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think in Glendale, it is automatically the top 2. So it's interesting because Glendale has 5 city council members, and effectively, in this cycle, only 2 were going to get elected, and both of these candidates that passed that threshold or got elected were both Armenian. But even there, when we look at the voter turnout, it was relatively low. It kind of stayed consistent with the numbers across the county. Other than that, are there any other races, statewide that you think should be on our radar?
Okay, so when we're looking at the state races, I want to think of it from the perspective of what the nation is going to be looking at now. The Senate race is a big one, but it's going to be a Democrat, for the most part, replacing another Democrat, at least my opinion.
This is the one left vacant by the death of Feinstein.
Yes.
Senator Feinstein.
So your top 2 candidates are Adam Schiff and Steve Garvey, and I'm not sure at this point if Steve Garvey is in first, or I think Adam Schiff is still in first.
I think there were 2 elections there, right? One for the unfinished term.
Yeah, one for the unfinished. That was confusing for people too, and the ballot was very confusing.
Can you explain that a little bit, just real briefly, what that was all about? Why there were 2 different elections there?
Yeah. So when Senator Feinstein passed away, there was an appointment that was made for her, and it was LaFonce Butler. It was the senator right now. She's the caretaker senator, if you will. She did not run for re-election.
Okay.
The first one that we voted for was to finish the end of her term. And then the second one is to give the full 6-year term.
I see. Okay.
So that's the 2 parts of it. But what people are going to be looking at is not necessarily our Senate rate as much. I think there's going to be some novelty about the Senate race, because you have,
like that word.
It's a great word. But there's going to be a novelty because you have this athlete who's running, who probably gives the Republicans a chance, a hope in their minds, but I don't think in this state it's going to happen. But there's going to be other races, especially for the control of Congress. There's about 8 or 10 races in California that are going to be very important that people are going to be looking at. Some of them are here in Southern California.
Okay, and that could potentially tip the scales, right, in the House of
Absolutely.
Representatives.
As of this taping, there's another Republican member of Congress who says he's stepping down at the end of, I believe, this month. So the margin that the Republicans have at this point is one vote. So it's going to be close no matter what. And if Democrats, because of redistricting or strong candidates or whatever it is, can pick up enough seats in various states across the country, they'll have enough to basically be able to hold the House or to be able to get the House at this point.
Okay. One other race, we're kind of coming back down to local, was the district attorney race at LA County that was pretty contentious. Attorney General Gascon has faced a lot of criticism for his policies. Some of it might be fair, some of it might be unfair. How do you think that's going to play out come November, given that field got narrowed down now? So
I think that what happens is that in this cycle, it seems like there's a lot of frustration and anger by a lot of people. Part of it is directed towards crime. Part of it is directed towards immigration. And I think that's driving a lot of sentiment for voters, which I don't necessarily can't speak too much about the immigration piece. But in terms of the crime piece, we see more and more data showing that crime is actually down nationally and in the various cities as well.
But not in Los Angeles. In Los Angeles, crime in general
Depends on the crime you look at.
Violent crime is down.
Violent crime is down. Property crimes are up. Some of it is syndicated crime, where basically there's criminals who are part of a collective. A lot of the smash and grabs that you see, right? So because there's frustration and anger and fear about these things, it has to be directed at somebody. And the easiest person to direct it to is the district attorney, who's got more of a progressive approach to dealing with not necessarily crime, but the prosecution of crime. We put a lot of people in jail that shouldn't.
Almost no prosecution.
There's prosecution of crimes. I think that.
But at this point, the biggest criticism of Gascon is that there isn't enough prosecution of crimes. Just the criminals that are committing these crimes are often not on the streets almost immediately, right? There's also the zero cash bail issue that's going on. Right?
I think some of the issues are statewide issues that the counties are dealing with, and especially like during COVID, a lot of people were let out of jail. Right? And people said, well, this is the DA that's doing it, because the DA was the closest person they can see, but it was being done at the state level. And I think there's also been some, like I say, I don't know if I can be quoted on this, because I'm not sure if it's legislation or if it was a voter proposition of basically reducing sentencing guidelines and also basically letting people out of prison, right? But again, it's directed at the local person, because that's the person that you see. That when the person is being let out of jail, they're being let out of a local jail, and then you assign it to the person who's the local person. And because he's a progressive, they think he's the one that's doing this.
Well, ultimately, though, the policies, whether they're at the state level or at the county or city level, are kind of aligned with the progressive politics that we're seeing in California, more and more so. So ultimately, the person might not be the right person to be pointing the finger at, but the policies are the same policies.
I would love to have another conversation, or if you can have a guest on here that knows a little bit more about criminal justice and how it's done. But I think that on the surface level, we tend to get upset about things without really digging deep into what it is that we're upset about. And I think some of the stuff, like we spend a lot of money on prisons, and there's a prison industrial complex, if you want to think of it that way, where basically it's in the interest of people who run prisons to have more prisoners. But as a taxpayer, we spend, somewhere between $60,000 to $70,000 $1,000 per person who's in a prison, in a California prison. We spend, $15,000 to $20,000 per student in a school. So if there's ways to have less people in prison who shouldn't be in prison, but should serve some kind of another punishment, then we should be thinking about ways to do that.
It's a slippery slope, though. I mean, there are also people that should be in prison that aren't in prison, but that is a bigger topic, and maybe we can have you and another guest on a future episode and kind of just dig into that topic. Let's talk a little bit about the big race in November, the presidential race. I think just like in the last several presidential elections, it's going to come down to a handful of swing states, don't you think?
Absolutely.
So which swing states do you think should be on our radar that we should be watching as the ones that are going to ultimately decide who the next president of the United States is going to be?
Okay, so I'm going to be watching Pennsylvania. I'm going to be watching Nevada. I'm going to be watching Michigan to see how Biden does, especially given some of the strong feelings of Arab American voters and progressive voters with the war in Israel. Georgia and Wisconsin and Arizona are like three other states that are going to be key states. So those are the states. Florida at this point has become a solidly Republican state. the Democrats have some hope aspirationally that they might be able to play in North Carolina. So those are the states that the two campaigns are going to be really fighting over. Or those are going to be the states that the campaigns are fighting over.
Interesting. So a lot of the head-to-head polls with Donald Trump and Joe Biden kind of show that Trump has maybe a slight edge. How do you think that plays out in November? You think that there's a possibility of Trump winning a popular vote, or you think even if the Electoral College somehow manages, if he wins the Electoral College, the popular vote will still go Democratic? What do you think the trend is there in the United States?
So what I would say is that with polls, just remember, polls are snapshots in time. You're looking at right now, what people are thinking and feeling right now. But people are also not paying attention. The partisans are paying attention right now. Partisans on the left, partisans on the right. And there's a bunch of other people who are paying attention like in a distance. It's not until we get to and through the summer when people begin to realize, okay, now it's happening. And I think at that point, just like in 2020, there was a lot of Republicans and independents basically held their nose and voted for Biden because they didn't want Trump again. Trump was still fresh in their minds. I think that the Biden campaign is going to do a lot to make sure that people remember Trump for what they remembered him in 2020. Because
it's going to be a hard sell, though. The economy is on people's minds, and the latest polls that we looked at, I think 70 or 80% don't approve of Joe Biden's performance on the economy.
Which is ironic, given the fact that the economy is growing. We're doing the best among our peers in developed countries with the economy. We have.
So you think it's more of a global phenomenon, the challenges that we're facing? It's unfair to attribute that to domestic policy?
I think people are always. I wish I had access to this poll because I could ask. So they asked how they were doing, and if you ask, how do you think somebody else is doing, the numbers are low. If they ask, how are you doing, the numbers are high. So people always think that somebody else is upset or not happy or discontent with something. But when you get it to the local level, that doesn't play out that way. It happens with Congress too. People hate Congress. You ask them, how do you like your congressman? They go, we love the guy, right?
Inflation is really killing pocketbooks of Americans, when you look at prices on everything. So it's going to be interesting to see whether, as you mentioned, whether Democrats are going to be able to paint a narrative of focusing on Trump from 4 years ago versus, what's going on today in the economy and inflation and all that stuff. So is there anything else that you'd like to kind of mention right now in terms of what you see the outlook being for the political system in this country?
So I think we're going to have a very exciting race, and it's going to be very nerve-wracking for a lot of people. There's a lot of genuine concerns about the state of American democracy, and I think sometimes we have to be careful when we throw that out, because I think when you question the state of American democracy, you begin to undermine American democracy in and of itself. But we do have a former president who is very strong in his beliefs of what he can do unilaterally and a vision of what America can look like in a second term of his. And when you look into the details of it, there's a lot to be worried about when it comes to American democracy. So that's the message that the Biden administration is going to try to push out to voters, and the Republicans are going to push out a message of fear of immigration, fear of crime, depending on what inflation's like, fear of inflation, fear of lots of things.
Sure.
Because that will end up driving people to go vote, and then it'll be referendum on the current president. And if it's a referendum on the current president, then fear is your friend, because people, have to feel bad and negative about the person to vote against that person.
It was very much kind of the same 4 years ago as well with the tables turned, though.
Absolutely.
Because Trump botched the COVID response, and
Absolutely.
That was primarily the reason. And the
also,
fear of that the Democrats were able to kind of project against Trump, was successful. So, Rostom, thank you.
Also was impeached twice, lied to the American public, went against the emoluments clause, had a bunch of other things. For another time, we could talk about the candidates individually if you want.
Sure.
But I think you should have somebody here who's an economist or somebody who knows much more about the economy, and you guys should really dig into this. I think your viewers would really appreciate it. So
thank you so much, Rostom, for being my first guest on Novelty. I think it's not going to be your last time on this show. We'll have you again because we can have very, very interesting conversations about a lot of topics together.
Yeah, and I appreciate you inviting me. When I got the invitation, I thought to myself, I want to make it good, But at the same time, I don't want to be agreeable for agreeableness. And I think maybe having a little bit of disagreeableness or disagreement in what we're thinking or how we approach things is a good thing.
Absolutely.
At least we can do it civilly.
Yeah. Thank you, Rostom. So as we wrap up our debut episode of Novelty, I want to extend my sincerest thanks to all of our viewers who joined us for this enlightening exploration. I'm also deeply grateful to Alpha News for providing us with this platform to dive into the rich tapestry of happenings, news, and intriguing topics that shape our world. Your engagement and interest will fuel our mission to deliver insightful commentary and investigative reporting that cuts through the noise of today's media landscape. With each episode, we'll strive to unravel the complexities of a world around us and shed light on stories that deserve attention. As we bring this initial broadcast to a close, know that our journey is just beginning. We have a wealth of captivating topics lined up for future episodes, and I invite you to stay tuned for more thought-provoking discussions and in-depth investigations. On behalf of the entire Novelty team, thank you for your support, and we look forward to continuing this journey of discovery and discourse with you in the episodes to come. Thank you.